So welcome everybody. I'm Laurie Olsen, and I'm really delighted to be here to share my new book, A Legacy of Courage and Activism, Stories from the Movement for Educational Access and Equity for English Learners in California. And thank you to the California Council of Teacher Education for co-sponsoring this today. The book is, I hope, going to be a resource for your students to illuminate some of the history in the roller coaster of politics and schooling for English learners, to inform and inspire their own advocacy, and to help them make sense of politics and schooling for English learners throughout the state. And I also hope that it will be a bit of an inspiration and support for you in your very essential work of teaching and of running teacher education programs to give us the strong teacher force that we need in the state. I think that to be a teacher of English learners or an administrator in a California school that serves immigrant students puts a person right at the crosshairs, right at the intersection, really, of some major social and political battles that have rocked our nation for well over a century, and has not only historically shaped what our schools are, but also daily impacts the workings of schools. And that the legacy of the movements against exclusionary forces and for educational access and equity for English learner and immigrant students is really rightly a legacy to be claimed, inspired by, and learned from by the teachers and administrators today. So that's really the spirit of this book and of the presentation today. An awareness that to be an effective caring teacher of English learner, immigrant, emergent bilingual students, to be an effective and compassionate and equity-focused administrator in California schools requires being an advocate. It requires understanding how inequities are structured in schools and how biases about language and culture are enacted in schools and how the larger politics and structures of exclusion impact schooling. And so it also requires having the skills of being an advocate. And this book, The Legacy of Courage and Activism, really speaks to that basic understanding about what it takes to be an educator in California today. So my purpose in the time we have together this afternoon is to give you enough sense of the book itself to explore what this legacy of activism might mean for teacher education and administrator preparation, and to think together about ways in which this material and the book itself might fit into your courses and your work of preparing educators to really teach and lead in California schools. So what I'd like to do first is get a sense of who's in the house with a good old poll, and just ask you, I think the poll should be posted in the chat. Just ask you to let us know, do you teach in a bilingual authorization program? Do you teach in a general teacher preparation program, an administrator preparation program? Are there other courses you're teaching in schools of ed, or some other role in supporting and teaching and preparing educators? And we'll see who we have here. I also want to invite you to write in the chat where you're teaching, so we have a sense of our reach across the state. And it's looking at this point, with about half of you having chimed in, that you have some other roles or you're in a general teacher preparation program. Those of you who are teaching other courses in a school of ed, I'd love to know what courses those are. Please post those in the chat. I believe this book has meaning in all of those contexts, but of course it's somewhat different. So, okay, Bakersfield, Northridge, UCLA, Cal State LA, Paramount. I've seen places all over the state. All right, welcome everybody. LAUSD, trying to catch up with my chat here to see where you're from. But it looks like we will close the poll at this point and share the results, and you'll see that about a third of you, a little over, are in general teacher preparation. We have about 13% in a bilingual authorization, but most are in other programs. A few of you are doing administrator preparation or other roles. All right, happy to see who you are and welcome. And we're going to stop sharing at this point. we know that the teaching of history is baked into what your formal roles are, right? It's in the TPEs, it's in the program standards for your programs. And so whether it's the teachers will be able to critically analyze how the context, structure, and history of public education in California affects and influences state districts and schools, or the understanding that beginning teachers must become familiar with issues of equity and justice within the structure and context of public education, or for administrators, the expectation related to external context and policy, that as education leaders, they're going to need to be able to influence political, social, economic, legal, and cultural context in order to play their role in improving education policy and practices, and that they're required to operate in a political context that's shaped by forces with a history they really need to understand in order to function effectively. And standards for bilingual authorization programs, the understanding that you need to be providing your candidates with knowledge of the history of bilingual education and bilingualism in the United States. So engaging candidates in learning about and understanding our history is part of your task. We know that. The question for today is, how does this book and the history and the stories within it and the perspective about the role of advocacy in that history, how does it contribute to fulfilling those TPEs and those standards? So we're actually going to start with the appendix, with the end of the book. And the appendix is a timeline that I call the sweep of history. While it's an appendix, it's actually a resource in and of itself to you. It spans 170 years, but focuses primarily on the past 80 years. It includes some key national events and trends that impacted California, but it's really focusing on the California story. And it's important because it's the backdrop for the chapters. It's a way to understand the chapters in relationship to each other and to other key events, and a way for us all to situate where we are now in the context of where we've been historically. So it is posted in the chat as its own separate handout, although it is part of the book. You all will be getting copies of the book, but I wanted you to have it today for this webinar, just as a reference. What we're going to be doing, I'm going to quickly and narratively give you a really broad brush background about the very early history of the timeline, kind of as a backdrop from before our lifetimes, because it situates us in some of those big veins of US history I mentioned already that still are impacting the education of English learners. And then I'm going to share a few of the stories from the past 50 years that are in the book, stories from our own lifetimes, to give you a sense of the kind of material in the book. And then after about 35, 40 minutes of that kind of presenting and sharing, we're going to talk more specifically about each of the book's chapters and about using the book in a teacher education and administrator preparation context. And we'll share some other resources for you. This will be about a 1 hour, 10-minute webinar. I know it was advertised to all the way till 2:30, but we will not go quite that long. So here's some of that broad brush early history. We were once a land where thousands of Native American languages were spoken. And then French, Russian, German, Portuguese, English were added as European arrivals began to settle colonies. So that by the time the framers of the new United States wrote the Constitution, they determined there should be no single official language in the new nation because it would privilege one group against another. And that tradition has now held for hundreds of years. There has never been and still isn't an official language of the United States. And yet, the battles over language as a marker of who's included and who's excluded, the ways in which the politics of language have been deeply entwined in battles over immigration, conquest, citizenship, enslavement, empire building, is a profound and deep vein in our nation's history. And education, schooling, whether it's dual language education, bilingual education, English learner education, immigrant education, has always been right there at the center of those battles. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the Mexican-American War, and the US paid $15 million to Mexico, giving the US ownership of a huge territory of Mexicans, whose languages were Spanish and indigenous languages, an area that now comprises all of California, roughly half of New Mexico, most of Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and Colorado. And Mexicans in those annexed areas had a choice. They could retreat back to within Mexico's new boundaries, or we're going to be incorporated into the United States. And as many have said, we didn't cross the border crossed us. And to this day, the issue of the place of Spanish in the schooling of children throughout the West and Southwest is still hotly contested. And large numbers of Chinese people were being brought to California to build the Transcontinental Railway. And even more immigrated then to California, attracted by the gold rush fever. And a whole series of anti-Chinese exclusion and discrimination acts greeted them, prohibiting Chinese American children from enrolling in schools. And in 1855, the very first California law was passed requiring instruction in schools had to be in English. This was also the era in which the US finally and formally ended Andrew Jackson's brutal Indian removal policy and began instead to pursue what they called an assimilation policy, largely through the forced education of immigrant children in boarding schools taken from their tribes off the reservations, where they were punished for using their own languages and for any behavior that displayed their indigenous cultures. And the curriculum was explicitly designed to eradicate Indian language and culture. And meanwhile, German immigrants throughout the Midwest had established German-speaking institutions like churches and schools. But in the buildup to the First World War, anti-German sentiment mixed with anti-immigrant sentiment created an unprecedented wave of language restriction. Laws banned German words. Teachers in German schools were jailed. The schools themselves were shut down. And the concept that to speak English was the marker of patriotism and the marker of being American took hold and was formalized in widespread policies to ensure that instruction in US schools would be in English. By the 20th century, California schools were formally English-taught institutions, racially and linguistically segregated, with less finance, less resource, separate schooling for African-American children, for Chinese descent children, for Spanish-speaking Mexican-American children. And the movements and battles to end unequal, segregated schooling set out to try to establish a legal end to discrimination, a legal end to segregation, and a legal right to equal educational conditions. And right here in California in 1931 in Lemon Grove, California, Mexican-American families refused their children being relegated to an inferior school system across town, the Mexican school. And they battled against the local school board to win an end to segregation, the first successful desegregation case in California. It was 2 decades later, in 1947, little self-disclosure, the year I was born, parents of 5,000 Mexican-American children in Orange County filed in federal court because their children were victims of unconstitutional discrimination by being forced to attend separate Mexican schools. And thus, when the courts ruled in their favor, the Mendez versus Westminster case legally struck down the basis for racial segregation for California, and the legal arguments forged in that case became a key part of the famous Brown v. Board of Ed Supreme Court decision that ended racial segregation a decade later for the nation. So race, ethnicity, skin color, language, national background were all deeply entangled and all rolled together in the dynamics of educational exclusion, segregation, and the dynamics of language policy for the nation. And all of those were spoken to in the huge civil rights movement push of the 1960s, leading to the passage of the federal landmark civil rights legislation that banned discrimination based on race, national origin, and ethnicity. So now I'm getting to the part of the time that's closer to our lifetimes, although I don't really know your ages out there, but generally our lifetimes. And these are the eras then that we're getting to that the book really focuses on. The stories of people who lived those battles, who some of them, like some of you, were part of shaping what has happened in California schools as the movement for language rights, for bilingual education, for English learner education took shape. I think of this time then as separated into 4 distinct eras. There was the time, the civil rights era back in the 70s and the 80s of building our bilingual education field, establishing bilingual policy, crafting program models, instructional practices, defining credentials and teacher preparation to meet the needs of English learners. And California became a national leader in bilingual education. It was followed by an era of backlash and pushback, in which most of those gains we'd made were contested and eventually largely destroyed. And then the hard times of the 1990s, the turn of the century, of entrenched and enforced English-only policy, attitudes, programs, accountability, and practices. And finally, a new era, the current era, the dawn of this era around 2012, which gave rise to wonderful new promising policies and a new embracing of bilingualism. It has been a roller coaster, a fascinating, complex, whiplashing roller coaster, and one that you have been part of in some way. So let's just see, in terms of who's here. When did you enter the field of education in California? Did you enter into it into the 70s and 80s in that time? Did you enter in the 90s? Did you enter in the 2000s? Did you come in since 2012? And let's just see in our poll who we have. And as you're voting and letting us know, what I'd really like to encourage you to do is, as I'm sharing some of the stories from these eras, if you were there, if you remember, if you have a story from then, let us know in the chat. And if hearing these stories makes you think, ooh, I never knew that, but hearing it now helps me make sense of XYZ, please let us know. So it looks like the 44%, most of you entered in the 1990s. So it's right smack in that era as we were heading into the pushback, the backlash, the English only era. And only 16% of you were from before then, during the heady times of us really building the field. Some of you have come in about 22% since 2012, coming in during this very robust time of exciting support for dual language, et cetera. So let's just be mindful of who we are and what our part of the story is as I go into the stories. Thank you for voting. And I'm going to move on. Somebody's already remembering about Vivid, the debates. I'm going to have to go back to the record of all of this and read the chat much more carefully, because I really do want to know what those stories are. But let's turn now and hone in on these eras by sharing 6 of the stories that are in the book. And again, think about your own experiences as I do so. So in that first era, I want to share one story for you. Did you know that a Chicano youth movement in San Diego in the 1970s emerged energized by the national civil rights movement, using student walkouts to press their demands? Access to college preparation courses, an end to equating accents and use of Spanish with being of lesser intelligence. They wanted bilingual education and curriculum that incorporated the contributions and experiences of their communities. They called for teachers and counselors who believed in them, teachers and counselors who looked like them, and respect for their language and culture. To them, a civil rights movement had to include reform of public schools. At that same time, a significant presence of Latinos in San Diego in those years, there was no representation from that community in politics. Pete Chacon, part of that young, passionate group of Chicanos, had used his GI benefits to earn a college degree and become a teacher in Vista, not too far from San Diego, where he was struck by the injustices of many Spanish-speaking children being segregated from other students and placed into classes for the mentally retarded because they did not speak English. He was convinced that changes in schools was needed, and so he took a leave from his school position to run for state assembly, representing the 70th district, which was the heart of the Latino community in San Diego at the time, explicitly committed to changing school policy. To finance that campaign, he cashed in his teacher's retirement. He and his wife sold their home, and it was his campaign that galvanized and was fueled by that Chicano student movement. And for that community, it was an awakening. It was a campaign in which they cut their teeth as activists, going door to door, canvassing, polling, phone banking. And Chacon won that state assembly seat in a surprise upset. It was a seminal win for that community. Those young, passionate activists were instrumental in having elected the first Chicano activists to the state legislature, where Chacon authored the very first bill in California funding services for English learners and allowing funds for bilingual education, and later authored the strongest bilingual education bill in the nation. So one lesson from that story is that we all need our communities represented in the legislature. We need bilingual educators in the political realm. And the lesson that we've seen over and over again is that relationships forged in the heart of advocacy campaigns last a lifetime, as that group of activists in San Diego are still very active. And here's another story. Did you know that after the passage of Chacon's bilingual bicultural education bill, the race was on to figure out what bilingual education really meant, what it looked like, and the phones were ringing off the hook at the Department of Ed as administrators and teachers throughout the state were saying, what are we supposed to do? What is this bilingual education thing? What are the expectations? Luckily, there was a powerful advocate, Guillermo Lopez, leading the bilingual education office at the Department of Ed, who located and called together the top bilingual theorists and researchers he could find in the field, and charged them with articulating what was known about bilingual development and second language acquisition, so questions could be answered for practitioners. They were people like Jim Cummins, Eleanor Thonis, Stephen Krashen, and others, and together they created the theoretical framework for schooling language minority students, an astonishing collection of ideas that still are in many ways the bedrock of the bilingual field. Things like common underlying language proficiency and dual language transfer and comprehensible input and language is culture and that language embodies culture. That team of researchers and theorists then partnered up with advocates in county offices of education and districts, traversing the state, sharing their theories, working with teachers to pilot and experiment. They went after and leveraged Title VII federal funds for demonstration projects and professional development. It was an amazing time of field building. And it is so important for teachers now to know there was once a time of major investment in professional learning and development, for them to know the roles that teachers played historically in grappling with research and adapting it to classrooms and building a knowledge base of practice. It was an exciting, bold chapter in the history, driven by advocates within the system acting boldly and by a marriage of research and practice. You can read more about it in the chapters of the book I'll tell you about later. But I want to know, were you there? Do you remember those people? Some of you I know were in schools during that era. And so I want to look back through the chat and just see what your stories were. Teacher leader in a district, just post 227. Any of you get Title VII funds to be able to do new demonstration programs? Here's a student taught 5 multilingual students in a closet during that time, as everyone was trying to figure out, what does this thing that we're supposed to do? It was an amazing time of learning, of building, and of resources going into the building. But it didn't last. It was followed by what I think of as the perfect storm, an era of pushback, backlash, and English only. A major new immigration wave was coming to California from Central America, South America, from the Southeast Asian wars, and the demographics of communities started to shift. More and more cultural and language diversity, a shrinking white majority. This overlaid with a brutal economic recession led to scapegoating immigrants, and a vociferous English-only movement began to push back. First, ballot initiatives to try to establish English as the official language of California, which passed but was declared unconstitutional. And then another one against using public resources for undocumented immigrants, which passed and was declared unconstitutional. And finally, in Prop 227, an initiative against bilingual education. And during that time, in the lead up to Proposition 227, there were multiple forces eroding the bilingual movement, including some policy compromises that the movement ended up making. So my third story is about some of that dynamic. Remember Pete Chacon, his bill, California's Comprehensive Bilingual Bicultural Education Act in 1976, that had mandated bilingual education where 20 or more students at a grade level had a home language other than English. He also required appropriately trained teachers. I will note, by the way, that in one of the revisions to the bill, in one of the political battles, he was forced to drop the bicultural part. In the urgency of the moment and getting the bill passed, the bill had failed to allow for a phase-in time. So there was no adequate timeline for institutions of higher ed to gear up to train bilingual teachers. And that, my friends, or there was no sufficient investment even in a pipeline for bilingual teachers. And that, on top of the English-only movement, was a recipe for fueling a huge backlash against implementing bilingual programs. It resulted in wave after wave of pressure and then legislation allowing waiver positions. So districts didn't really have to staff their classrooms with qualified teachers, weakening credentialing requirements. The implementation of effective bilingual programs was really hindered by the resentment and resistance of teachers against having to get additional training, the English-only attitudes that bilingual programs wouldn't really work, and the resulting staggering shortage of teachers to staff them. In telling her part of the story, Shelley Spiegel-Coleman, noted wonderful advocate and leader of Californians Together for so many years, reflected on what it was like. She said, "We ended up having to support those waiver provisions. The teachers just weren't there. And a bilingual program just isn't a good model without a strong approach to staffing the classroom. We ended up with a lot of weak classrooms because we relied on placing bilingual aides into classrooms with teachers who had no bilingual training. We had teachers who didn't want an aide, teachers without language skills, aides who were not supported or prepared to teach. Teachers didn't want to go to training and they resented being expected to do so. And as a result, we ended up with too many weak programs. And that was a part of what did end bilingual education at the time." So you can read about the political battles and the backlash and the chapter, Where Are the Teachers, which I'll talk more about later, because it really explains and illuminates the mess that we're in now as we still grapple with a major shortage of bilingual teachers, which is one of the obstacles, obviously, to growing dual language programs. And it describes the kind of shift in credentials and definitions of what a qualified, prepared teacher for English learners should be and how that responded to politics. And it brings home for us the lesson about needing to be insistent on investments in preparing and supporting teachers, and to hold strong on our best expertise and understanding of what the qualifications really are for good teaching. Now, that English-only era didn't just impact K-12. So my fourth story, my fourth did you know, is that the English-only movement played a major role in why it was that federal and state policy that was promoting the importance of preschool education ended up by defining school readiness, largely in terms of young children entering school with enough English. It was one of the death knells to what had been a growing bilingual dual language movement in early childhood. Linguist Lily Wong Fillmore had sought and was unable to get funding to document the impacts of English-only early education on children's attachment to their language and their impacts on the family. So what did she do? She stood up at a NABE conference and enlisted anybody at that conference who was willing to help her carry out what she called the NABE no-cost study, to go back to their communities and, using interview guides and protocols she made available in multiple languages, to document the language loss among young children and immigrant families who are in English-only early schooling. That all-volunteer research effort produced the first research on language loss and served as the first wake-up call to the damage of English-only early education. And as Lily recalled, the results were so consistent and widespread and dramatic, and painted such a powerful and painful picture of language loss and the impacts on families. We knew we had to share the findings widely. What was at stake was a family's ability to remain close to and connected to their children. So that story is part of the chapter on For the Youngest Learners. And the lessons learned just from that part of the story, from the NABE no-cost study, is about the importance of speaking our truths, documenting what we see happening, making visible the real impacts of our educational system on English learner children and families, even when the funding may not be available. So, like the story of the NABE no-cost study, the stories of how advocates persevered during the harsh days of the English-only era in California are really full of remarkable, creative, determined stories and the persistence of advocates throughout California. And that's an important legacy for everyone to know. But let me pause and give you a chance, and give me a chance to check in on the chat and what you've been saying. Were you there during those years, during those 227 years, during the English-only years? What do you remember? Did you feel the impact? And I want to try to catch up with Kathleen, who never had a chance to learn English, and Gilda's response to Lily Wong Fillmore. She is a warrior and she is a leader, and she was one of the models that led me into my advocacy for sure. Yes, and we do need to ensure that this attention to the pipeline of bilingual teachers is there. Otherwise, we know we will be lost. Okay, so now my final two stories before we get into the other parts of the book bring us into the new era. This era, which has tremendous awareness of the benefits of bilingualism, the positive impacts of dual language programs, an era of new dual language policy. And here's two stories from that. Did you know that it took 10 years, a full decade, for the campaign to work the state seal of biliteracy from its first trials in some very brave districts during the English only No Child Left Behind era, through to an initial introduction as legislation, all the way through passage in the legislature onto the governor's desk where it was vetoed. And then we went back, more districts, and went back to the legislature, all the way through the legislature, et cetera. That law went through 2 governors' vetoes, a 10-year campaign, before finally in 2012, it was signed into law as the first state in the nation to have such an honor for students with proficiency in 2 or more languages upon graduation from school. It is now spread to at least 42 other states in the nation, and a bill to establish a national seal of biliteracy is now introduced in Washington. It is the story of how an idea started so small after the devastating passage of Prop 227 and then refused to stop, gathering supporters and allies district by district, an asset-based paradigm growing bit by bit, never stopping, refusing to give up until we had sufficient political pressure to make it a reality. That's the story of the state seal of biliteracy. So many stories like these, actions like these, have led us to where we are now, having amassed a research base that so solidly serves as the rationale for dual language programs, has led to the passage of the EDGE initiative, in which voters spoke for wanting more opportunities for students to become bilingual, and then to the passage in 2017 of our visionary aspirational English learner roadmap policy, which superseded Proposition 227 and set dual language as a vision for the state. So now, as we all know, this is an era of supportive policy. And yet also, as we all know, we don't yet have in place the schooling system that yet honors and embraces our English learners, that supports their pathways to biliteracy, that enables them to bring and build upon their languages and cultures. So hopefully, the lessons derived from advocacy in the past can be helpful as we continue the work to bring about such a system. But it will require advocacy. And preparing new teachers and administrators to be those advocates is absolutely essential. And so I'm going to share one last story. I see some people advocated for the seal of biliteracy, yay, and CTA's key role in getting it finally passed. Thank you. So this last story is is personal for me. It's about a group of people, myself among them, who had come to know each other through the many decades of working together as advocates to build a bilingual movement, to weather the attacks against that movement, decades of supporting each other's efforts to create and deliver professional development, sponsor and pass legislation, build case law. And as we began to face retirement, began to feel the fatigue that comes with age, and still recognizing and reckoning with the huge amount of work still to be done, we tried to figure out what we could do to support a newer generation of advocates. And thus was born the English Learner Leadership and Legacy Initiative, fondly called ELLI. Around the table of what would be the steering committee of ELLI were representatives from CABE, from Californians Together, lawyers who'd argued key landmark bilingual court cases, educators who'd piloted powerful new bilingual models, researchers who'd worked to create the research base for our field, lobbyists and staff who'd worked in Sacramento on the legislation, all of us trying to figure out what would it look like if we could codify what those skills and knowledge an advocate needs to really keep this movement going. And around a dining room table, we hammered out that vision to develop a new generation of strong, well-informed, skilled, courageous, and activist leaders to build and sustain the movement for educational equity and excellence for English learners. and our work began to define the competencies, skills, and knowledge, something that you all as teacher and administrator educators know well. The story of Ellie and how those process and content objectives would become a curriculum and then a whole statewide initiative, beginning with just 19 fellows and then blossoming into a network of hundreds of advocates, is chapter 1 of the book. It is the story of what it looked like for us to try to create the curriculum and to enact a curriculum that would result in such advocates. We're posting in the chat for you the advocacy process and content objectives, because it's a resource for you now. And even though you will get it as part of the book, we want you to see it. And you will notice in that at the very top of the list is knowledge of the history and legacy of the movements for language rights, educational access, and justice for English learners. In fact, this whole book, though, is an outgrowth of the Ellie curriculum, researched and written as part of Ellie. The full story of Ellie is in the book, but for now, I just want to point out that even in the name of Ellie, the word legacy was that firm conviction that our history matters. We knew there was an unwritten story about the movement that might be helpful to advocates and educators now, that could illuminate lessons learned, advocacy strategies that had worked and that hadn't worked, because we know that when history is not written, when it isn't told, when it isn't known, each generation is left on their own. So I took on the task as part of Ellie of documenting and writing some of that history, motivated first by trying to capture some key advocacy moments in that history and some key advocacy strategies we wanted to illuminate, and then wanting to fill in the background on some key issues that were being fought about today. So the stories that became the chapters of this book were selected based on that. The approach was to conduct oral histories and interviews with people who had been deeply engaged as advocates and leaders in those campaigns, and then to augment those with archival research. So the stories I told you are some of the stories, but the history weaves together those stories and includes a lot of archival research as well. The book is dedicated, as you can read here, to the remarkable group of people who were interviewed. Dedicated with deep gratitude for courage and inspiration to the hundreds of advocates and activists whose stories were told in this volume and whose voices and actions have fueled the movement to create schools that open doors and honor the intellect and dreams of English learner students, families, and communities. The book's comprised of 10 chapters in 4 different sections. So it's not chronological, it's more thematic this way. The first section on movement building, the second on a historical review of some key issues, the third section on various advocacy campaigns and what those look like, and the fourth section on the many roles of advocates. So I'm going to very briefly tell you about each of these, and then we're going to get a chance to dig in on what this all means. The first section, movement building, begins with that story of Ellie, as I've already described, where it came from, the 3 years of working with Ellie Fellows, the relationships, the transformations that occurred, and it describes how those objectives became a curriculum and what that curriculum looked like, what we actually did to help develop those skills. That section continues with the chapter on the San Diego story. And so now you recognize that from the story of Pete Chacon and his campaign and that, et cetera. But it also includes the establishment of enduring institutions like PK, the Parent Institute for Quality Education, the battle over Chicano Park, the founding of the Chicano Federation, the building of San Diego County Office of Education into the national leader it became in Spanish language arts and bilingual education, the creation of the San Diego State University programs of teacher education and liberation education, and more. And it importantly illustrates how education is fought for as an integral part of a civil rights movement, and how within a district, within a region, the actions of one group of people create the conditions and supports for the actions of others. The sweep of history section includes 2 chapters. The first one is the one on the teacher shortage, the one that most directly in a way pertains to you and the work you do, beginning with early cases like Lau and Castaneda that required qualified teachers, and then the efforts to define what that meant, and then the whole roller coaster of the efforts to define credentials weaken credentials, create waivers, etc. It traces the English-only movement pushback against teachers having to get additional training, how Prop 227 effectively killed the demand for bilingual teachers, takes us through the ELD era and the renewed effort in the past bit of time to really focus again on teachers for dual language programs. I do want to read to you a little bit from the introduction to that chapter, just because it's really meant for you. It's spoken to you. As is true for all students, access to education for English learners is profoundly impacted by whether or not they have teachers prepared to understand and address their needs. Ever since the landmark Federal Civil Rights Act was passed in 1965, establishing that discrimination would not be tolerated on the basis of race, ethnicity, and national origin, efforts to ensure an adequate supply of prepared and qualified teachers has been central to building a system that ensures equal educational opportunity for English learners. The history of these efforts includes everything from federal mandates, landmark court cases, state legislation, public ballot initiatives, major advocacy battles, and more. And at every stage, these efforts have been met by resistance, which has severely constrained the preparation of bilingual, biliterate teachers. It is a story of advocacy efforts and compromises, unintended consequences, and backlash. It is also a story of seemingly good policy and program approaches that failed in the context of larger political forces. And as a result, more than 50 years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, we're still confronted with the need to mount a vigorous effort, a new effort, to address the fundamental issue of the shortage of teachers prepared to meet the needs of English learners. The story of the dance between advocacy and resistance has instructive lessons for those seeking to understand our current shortage of prepared teachers, and for those who are engaged in trying to shape the preparation of teachers to serve the needs of our students today. So that's that chapter. Almost done with these. Then the next chapter in that same section on the sweep of history key issues is the one on dual language learners in early childhood education. Really important for us now, where we've got the governor's master plan for early learning and a major expansion of public investment in early childhood and moving of a lot of that into the K-12 system. And so the story of the push back and forth between K-12 system trying to push more academic preparation down into early education, and early educators trying to hold strong to their understanding of early development. That's part of this story. The battle between universal versus targeted policies, those trying to call attention to the real specifics of cultural diversity versus those who are holding strong to kind of generic child development notions. This is the chapter that really fills all of that in. Then section 3 describes 2 different advocacy campaigns so people can see what that looks like. So one of them is the State Seal of Biliteracy. I gave you a little story about that before, but this is also where you'll find a lot of the deep discussion about Prop 227 and those campaigns around Prop 227 and the way in which it affected the state. It's the description of the relationship between grassroots organizing and impacting legislation and the governor. And it's the power of vision-based work. The next chapter in that section of advocacy campaigns is the advocacy campaign around long-term English learners, which was about a research project, Reparable Harm, and illustrates the role of research in the political process and the importance of documenting what we're seeing and raising awareness for the field. And then the 4th section, just very briefly, gives some very different stories about what advocacy looks like coming from different sectors, coming from the Department of Education, coming from the county offices of ed, coming from advocacy organizations outside of the school system, lobbying, the role of lobbying. And in all of that, you will find the stories, for example, of the Diana lawsuit, the Diana case, so important to end the use of assessments only in English to place Spanish-speaking students into classes for the mentally retarded. This is where you're going to read that story about the theoretical framework and that was developed back in the 70s. There's no one single chapter that just takes on Prop 227, and we did that on purpose because while it was the most defining moment in many ways of California's movement for English learner and bilingual education, the long-term devastating impacts of that anti-bilingual policy and the way in which English-only mentality found its way into enduring beliefs and practices throughout the state has touched every effort since that time to create a schooling system responsive to English learners. And so every chapter in the book in some way tells part of that story. It's by looking across the chapters you get the strongest sense of it. So I've spoken now for 45 minutes, long enough. And before I have some more things to tell you about, but I want to give you a chance to do some talking and put you into small groups and just have you share how might you envision using this book or chapters from this book in your courses, and what gaps might it fill in telling the history? What does this fill that there's been a need for? And how might it help your students become the advocates they need to be for English learners? And what other thoughts do you have about this as a resource? So this is your chance to connect it to your work and to talk to some of your colleagues. We're going to give you 8 minutes, and then we will come back for a few more resources and to close it out. Thank you. So that really taking care of each other, really seeing each other as a part of something together is essential. Cross-generational relationships are powerful and sustaining for everybody. Individual advocacy and collective action are all needed. Sometimes people can feel like, oh, I didn't go testify, I must not be, I'm not doing what I need to do. But it may be the individual advocacy for that one student in a classroom who really needs an adult speaking out on their behalf is also advocacy, but it's also not enough. And so understanding the relationship between individual advocacy and collective action is essential. Understanding the system. Schools are complicated systems. And if we don't understand where certain kinds of decisions are made and how they're made and what pressures those different bodies to make the decisions they make, we cannot be the effective advocates we need to. So everyone needs to understand the system. Leveraging the inside-outside dynamic came through quite clearly throughout many of the chapters. The importance of having outside advocacy organizations that can act quickly, that can voice things in a way that people within the system sometimes don't have the freedom to do. But the importance of having people inside the institutions who actually, A, really understand what's going on in them, but also have certain kinds of authority and power and standing to make changes. And so leveraging that dynamic is crucial. Reflective practice and self-care, taking care of ourselves, thinking about what we're doing, thinking critically about what we're doing, and being kind to ourselves. We are in it for the long haul, and we need to learn, and we need to keep growing and keeping on. Those are some of the lessons in the handout for you to think about for yourself. You're all advocates within your teacher education programs and your own teaching, as well as otherwise, and for the students that we are trying to help become advocates. We were going to take some time to actually pause on that, but I think we're just going to give that to you. They're in the book. As I said, you're going to be getting the book. I wanted to mention one other important resource, which is not in the book, but it's a companion to the book, and it's available to you free. And that is a video resource of the history of bilingual and English learner education in California that is a little over an hour long as a full video, but it's in 4 parts. It has been used. Alice Briceño at San Jose State has used it in a course where she breaks it up, uses one section of it, uses some of the case studies from the book, and then goes on to the next section. It can be very useful as an additional resource for you, either in connection with the book or not. And finally, I want to close with a few of the words from the book itself and a few comments. We're still, as you know, far from having the system that we need, and we have a lot of work to do, and our teachers and administrators are on the very front lines of carrying that work forward. From the introduction to the book, it says, we need an army of advocates steeped in the history that brought us to this point, inspired by the victories and successes of the advocacy movement of the past, equipped to understand the complex dynamics and scars in the present that stem from that history, and bolstered and supported in the knowledge of the movement's resilience and survival through hard times. So I think that preparing and supporting people to be the teachers and administrators that we need we have to be preparing them to be these advocates and to know that history, because they need to understand how change occurs. And maybe that's the deepest meaning of this book. It illuminates advocacy. It illuminates the way in which actions taken by real people in real time in various places adds up to form a movement. And I want them to see that their actions matter. Their actions add up over time together with the actions of other teachers and administrators down the road across the state. I want them to see themselves in history as part of making history and even writing their own stories in history. And for every one of you that wrote in the chat today about remembering certain things that had happened, I hope you do some writing too. So the final quote from the book is, much of the history of the struggle for language rights, educational justice, and access is not yet written, is yet unwritten. May this collection inspire others to share what they've witnessed, what they've been part of, what they have done, and write the fuller story that represents more widely the persistence, passion, and hard work it takes to counter the forces of exclusion and to create equitable, joyful, excellent schools that do justice to the children of California of all languages and cultures. So those are my hopes for you. Those are my hopes for the book. I'm excited for you to have it. I'm excited to hear about how you use it and any reactions you have. Why don't you go on and give them the other information as questions pop up? We can answer them. So Ruth, take it away.
Okay. Uh-oh. Not working. I got frozen.
While we're waiting, Lynn Scott, are you still on?
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, Laurie, thank you. Laurie, thank you for your presentation. Thank you for doing this for Cal Council, the joint collaboration with Cal Council and CalTog. While everyone is still on and posting their questions, I just want to say thank you for the inspiration. The breakout room that I was in talked about how individuals at all levels need to be reading and thinking about that so that they put English learners at the beginning when designing their programs and their curriculum. Everyone from, someone commented in their district, administrators need to read this, that in induction programs, new teachers need to have access to this information and discuss it in their school districts, and that teacher candidates need to also be exposed to this to see where their experiences fit in this history and then understand the history. So thank you for the work and effort into this and documenting this and publishing this work.
Thanks, Lynn, and thanks, Cal Council.
Great. Okay, so my slides are finally up. Thank you, Lynn, and thank you, Laurie. Incredible presentation. And we have to build on that because what we're doing is we actually have a new cohort coming out. Ellie, as she affectionately called our English Learner Leadership and Legacy Initiative, will actually be starting a new cohort for a 4-day institute this fall. Through some grant funding, we have this opportunity for fully funded mid-career professionals to get, go deeper into all the lessons learned and learned from our legends and senior leaders in the field, all their expertise and lessons learned. So if you know anyone or if yourself is interested, everyone from classroom educators, school administrators, professors, we have other people from outside organizations all around the idea of being an English learner advocate. Please consider. There's an informational flyer that'll be in the chat, but it's right now. You can, get in there in terms of being in the loop. The application's open in May. Okay, and then I also want to share. Why is my screen not letting me go to the next slide? There we go. You're all invited if you'd like to join a book club to even go deeper. We're gonna have 4 sessions. It'll be starting April 21st. Every other week, just to delve deep, to talk about the stories, add your own stories, and think about the future and how we're going to be continuing this movement. So please consider or spread the word on our book club as well. You're all invited, and there's also another link there for the book club, for the book flyer itself, which gives you that great overview of all the chapters of the book. And then finally, you guys, hopefully you're not wondering, hopefully you know how you're going to get your free desk copy, but we definitely want to share desk copies with all of those who might be able to touch the next generation of English learner advocates. And so your attendance today and the address that you've provided when you do the sign-in sheet today, or on your registration, if you provided the address, we will be able to send out that copy. The sign-in sheet today is really important because we want to know whether you'd like that electronic copy ebook or whether you'd like a physical paper copy or printed copy of the book. So yeah, so we've got just this incredible gift from Laurie and from all those voices in the book, and we hope that that it resonates with you and that it provides the information and the knowledge and the inspiration for what's next for us. And want to compliment and congratulate all of you that are on the call as well, because all your work would not have been possible for any of us to be here, right, in terms of working with English learners. So the closure today, Laurie?
Just thank you for the work you do. Stay safe.
And anybody who has any last words, you're welcome to unmute and feel free to shout out or put in chat any feedback. Thank you so much.
Laurie, I just wanted to say I'm a huge fan, and I love the way you present this information in a way that I can understand and connect to. Even though I never was an English learner myself, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie. Thanks, Ruth and Crystal.